Most people imagine World War II as something that happened far from American soil, fought in the trenches of Europe, on the beaches of Normandy, or in the jungles of the Pacific. But between 1942 and 1943, the war crept shockingly close to home. German U-boats, the infamous submarines of Hitler's navy, silently entered the Gulf of Mexico. Their mission was brutal and strategic. Sink Allied merchant ships, choke off critical supply lines, and strike fear into the heart of the American home front. Over that short period, they sank 56 ships and damaged 14 others, all while losing just one of their own. On the night of June 29, 1942, the British tanker HMS Empire Mika was on its way toward Key West, Florida, preparing to join a convoy bound for the United Kingdom. It was loaded with over 11,000 tons of kerosene and crewed by 47 men. Lurking less than a mile away was U-67, a German submarine preparing to strike. Just after 1 a.m., 2 torpedoes were fired. The explosion ignited the tanker instantly, sending thick black smoke into the sky and turning the surrounding ocean into a burning inferno. Survivors later described fleeing into lifeboats as the flames devoured the ship. Only one lifeboat made it safely to shore, carrying just 14 men. As the vessel broke apart and sank, German sailors stood on the deck of U-67, watching the destruction. One of them even captured the scene in a photograph, a grim trophy from a forgotten front of the war. The Empire Mika was just one of many victims of a campaign that would come to define a forgotten chapter of the war. The Gulf of Mexico, stretching from Florida to Texas and down to the Yucatan Peninsula, became a key target in the Nazis' Atlantic operation. This offensive was part of the wider Battle of the Atlantic, where the Germans aimed to disrupt Allied shipping routes. Operation Drumbeat, which began shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, evolved quickly. By May 1942, the Germans had expanded their focus into the Gulf, sending 24 U-boats to patrol the region. Their results were devastating. In May 1942 alone, German submarines were sinking nearly 1 Allied ship per day in the Gulf. These weren't just symbolic losses. The ships targeted were tankers, trawlers, and freighters carrying vital materials like gasoline, aviation fuel, bauxite, and refined oil products, all crucial to the Allied war effort in Europe. The scale and frequency of the attacks made the Gulf the most dangerous stretch of water in the world during that summer. The United States, still unprepared for such a direct threat, had few defenses in place. Ships often sailed without escorts, and coastal blackout protocols were not yet in effect. German commanders even noted how easy their targets were to find. One log from U-507 reported that navigational lights in Florida were still burning brightly, as if it were peacetime. Several key factors allowed the Germans to dominate early in the Gulf campaign. First, the U.S. military was caught completely off guard. Merchant ships were not equipped to defend themselves, and organized convoys were slow to form. Second, the German Navy upgraded their Enigma cipher machines in 1942, temporarily blinding the Allies to their plans and movements. This allowed U-boats to operate in near total secrecy, slipping in and out of American waters undetected. And third, early attempts to spot submarines from the air were largely ineffective. The Civil Air Patrol, made up of volunteer pilots, could observe and report sightings but had no weapons to stop the attacks. In fact, none of the U-boats lost in the Gulf were destroyed by aircraft, despite the growing role of aviation in modern warfare. The American public, for the most part, had no idea this was happening. That was by design. The U.S. Office of Censorship imposed heavy restrictions on reporting any ship sinkings near American waters. Their goal was twofold: prevent panic on the home front, and avoid letting the Germans know just how effective their attacks had been. As a result, much of the story vanished from public memory. Decades later, historians still refer to the Gulf Campaign as one of the most overlooked parts of the entire war. The press blackout, combined with more high-profile battles occurring elsewhere like Midway, Stalingrad, and Guadalcanal, meant that this theater of war never received the recognition it deserved. The human toll was staggering. It's estimated that nearly 600 Allied sailors, mariners, and civilians died in the Gulf Campaign. While this number may seem small compared to battles like D-Day, it represents a massive and personal tragedy, especially given the campaign's silence in history books. Several of the wrecks, including the Empire Mica, have been located and turned into diving sites, but many more remain undiscovered, resting thousands of feet below the ocean's surface. The deeper wrecks are hard to reach and costly to explore. Over time, many of them will simply decay into the sea floor, erasing the final traces of the campaign. The tide began to shift by late 1943. The U.S. government finally enforced coastal blackouts, dimmed lighthouses, and established information blackouts to protect shipping routes. Merchant vessels began traveling in convoys, protected by naval escorts. Aerial reconnaissance improved, and radio listening stations helped track U-boat movements more effectively. These combined efforts gradually pushed the German submarines out of the region. The last Allied ship sunk in the Gulf was the tanker Touché, hit off the coast of Texas in December 1943. One of the most dramatic encounters occurred on July 30th, 1942. When U-166 torpedoed the American passenger steamer SS Robert E. Lee, killing 25 people. However, U-166 was immediately targeted by the ship's escort, Navy patrol craft PC-566, which launched depth charges and destroyed the sub just minutes later. Despite the success, the Navy refused to credit the patrol craft at the time, insisting that a Coast Guard plane had sunk the U-boat days later in a different location. It wasn't until 2001, when a deep-sea oil survey discovered the wrecks of both the Robert E. Lee and U-166 just a mile apart, that the truth was confirmed. Today, the Gulf U-boat campaign remains largely unknown to the American public. Historians like Martin K. A. Morgan and Michael Gannon have worked hard to bring attention to this overlooked front. Gannon even argued that the strategic losses caused by U-boats in U.S. waters were more damaging than Pearl Harbor. In hindsight, the campaign revealed just how unprepared the U.S. had been, and how deeply vulnerable the American coast was during the early years of the war. It also showed that even in a global conflict, the battle could come frighteningly close to home.